For an American soldier in the mid-20th century, the pistol was never supposed to be the star of the show. The real war lived in rifles, machine guns, artillery, in the big tools that moved front lines on maps. And yet, on the belts of officers, tankers, pilots, and engineers, there was a small heavy piece of steel that kept showing up in the worst 30 seconds of a man's life. When a rifle jammed in a jungle trench, when a tank was burning and the crew had seconds to get out, when a pilot hit the ground far from his own lines. In those moments, the war shrank down to one hand, one magazine, and 7 rounds of .45 ACP. This is the story of the M1911A1, the American sidearm that served generations. Chapter 1. Why America Wanted a .45. Years before the M1911 had a model number, Colonel John T. Thompson sat on a U.S. Army board and wrote that the new service pistol should not be of less than .45 caliber. It was a dry line in an ordnance report born out of very bloody experience. The story of the M1911 does not begin in Europe, and not even in the trenches of the First World War. It begins in hot, humid air, in sugar fields and villages in the Philippines at the turn of the 20th century. There, American troops met opponents who did not always fall down when hit. The standard sidearm of the time was a double-action revolver in .38 long Colt. On paper, it looked adequate. On the ground, reports kept coming back of charging attackers who took 1, 2, 3 hits, and still closed the distance with a blade in their hand. Some of that was about physiology and adrenaline. Some of it was about tactics and belief. But in the minds of officers writing those reports, one conclusion hardened. They wanted a bigger hole. The Army reached back into storage for older .45 caliber revolvers. Suddenly, the old single-action Army was back in holsters in the jungle. At the same time, in ordnance offices and test ranges, a new requirement took shape. The next American service pistol would not be a small-bore revolver. It would be a semi-automatic pistol in at least .45 caliber, powerful enough to stop a determined attacker at close range. Into that requirement stepped John Moses Browning. Browning was a Utah gunsmith's son who had spent his life making firearms that worked in the real world. By the early 1900s, he had already designed rifles, shotguns, and machine guns for Colt and Winchester. Now, working with Colt, he turned his attention to a new automatic pistol. Army trials in 1906 were not gentle. Pistols had to fire thousands of rounds without cracking frames or choking on dirt. Some of the testing that led up to those trials included the grim Thompson-Lagarde experiments, shooting cadavers and livestock with various calibers to see which stopped most reliably. The answer the Army liked was .45. Browning responded with a pistol and a new cartridge, the .45 automatic Colt pistol, .45 ACP, a heavy, relatively slow bullet built not for long-range elegance, but for hard hits at the distances where pistols were actually used. In 1911, after years of redesigns and torture tests, the United States Army adopted Browning's pistol as its standard sidearm. They called it simply the United States Pistol, model of 1911. It went to France in the hands of doughboys in the First World War. There, in mud and rain, it earned a reputation for reliability and close-range authority. After the war, soldiers and ordnance officers sent back a familiar kind of feedback. The gun worked, but the trigger felt long for some hands. The flat-back strap did not suit everyone. The hammer tended to bite the web of the hand. The sights were small and fragile. Rather than start over, the Army refined. In the 1920s, the frame was scalloped behind the trigger guard to give the index finger more room. The main spring housing was given a gentle arch to change the angle of the grip. The grip safety spur was lengthened to protect the shooter's hand from the hammer. The trigger itself was slightly shortened. In 1926, the updated pistol received a new designation, M1911A1. It was, in every important way, the same Browning pistol, but easier to live with for the men who would carry it through the next 3 wars. Chapter 2: Steel, Recoil, and the Way a 45 Feels in the Hand. At first glance, an M1911A1 looks simple: a steel frame, a slide riding on rails, a single stack magazine in the grip, a short straight trigger. Inside, the design is clever. When a round is fired, the barrel and slide are locked together by lugs machined into their tops. Pressure builds. Barrel and slide move backward together, just a fraction of an inch. Then a small cam surface under the barrel tips its rear down, unlocking those lugs. The slide continues back on its own, pulling the empty case from the chamber and throwing it out the side. The hammer is recocked. A stout spring under the barrel drives the slide forward again, stripping the next 45 ACP round from the magazine and pushing it into the chamber. The barrel tilts back up, locks into the slide, and the cycle is ready to repeat. For the shooter, none of that motion is visible. What he feels is the weight and the recoil. Unloaded, an M1911. A1 weighs roughly 39 ounces. Loaded with 7 rounds in the magazine and 1 in the chamber, it is closer to 2 3/4 pounds. That sounds heavy on paper, but on the range, modern shooters who pick up a good M1911A1 often say the same thing. The recoil is there, but it is a firm push, not a sharp snap. The all-steel frame soaks up energy. The relatively slow 45 bullet gives the gun a steady shove straight back, instead of whipping the muzzle high. For someone who has only shot light polymer 9mm pistols, that first magazine through a full-size 45 can be a surprise. It is louder, it moves more, and yet, shot after shot, the sights keep coming back to where they should. Part of that is the trigger, the M1911. A1 is single action. The hammer must be cocked for the first shot, either manually or by carrying the pistol cocked and locked. Hammer back, thumb safety on, a round already in the chamber. Once that hammer is back, the trigger stroke is short and clean. There's a take-up, a distinct wall, and then a break that, in a good example, feels more like a switch than a squeeze. Soldiers in wartime did not talk about crisp 4-pound pulls or glass rod break, but they noticed that with this pistol, they could put the front sight on a close target, press, and the shot would go where their eyes were looking. Safety matters as much as feel. Browning's design layers safeties in a way that, by the standards of the day, was remarkably modern. There is the grip safety, a lever in the back of the grip that must be fully depressed by the hand before the gun can fire. There is the thumb safety on the left side of the frame, up for safe, down for fire, that locks the sear and holds the hammer. There is a half-cocked notch that can catch the hammer if something goes wrong. There is a disconnect that prevents the gun from firing unless the slide is fully in battery. To carry an M1911A1 cocked and locked is to trust all of those pieces working together. By the Second World War, that was exactly how American officers, NCOS, and many specialists carried it. Hammer back, thumb safety up, holstered on the hip or chest, ready to go from safe to firing with a single, practiced motion of the thumb. No machine is perfect. Soldiers and modern shooters alike learned that the magazine is often the weak point. Drop a magazine hard on concrete and bend the thin steel lips at the top, and the careful stack of cartridges inside can turn into a jam waiting to happen. Use a magazine with a tired spring, and the last rounds may not rise fast enough to meet the slide. But with good magazines and reasonable maintenance, the old 45 earned its reputation the hard way, by working again and again in mud, in sand, in cold so bitter that oil turned to sludge. It had weaknesses. It was heavy. It held only 7 rounds in its standard military magazine. Its small sights were meant for combat at 50 meters and under, not for bullseye games on a sunny Saturday. Yet for the roles it was built for, short-range defense, close quarters leadership, last resort survival. The balance of weight, power, and reliability made sense to the people who depended on it. Chapter 3. In the worst seconds of a war. Because the M1911A1 was never a mass-issue rifle, it shows up in history not as the star of big set-piece battles, but as a supporting actor in small, intense moments. Picture an American officer on a Pacific island in 1943. His Marines have waded ashore through chest-deep water and machine gun fire. Their rifles are coated in sand. They are pushing toward concrete bunkers set into a low coral ridge. In that kind of fight, rifles do most of the work. But when a man hits a doorway and a Japanese defender suddenly appears within a few yards, it is often faster to rip the .45 from its flap holster, thumb off the safety, and fire from the hip than to wrestle a long Garand inside a bunker mouth. Veterans of Tarawa and other island battles remember the pistol in exactly those terms. Not as a daily tool, but as something that saved my life in a doorway, or got me through when the rifle went dead and there was no time. Across an ocean in Europe, tank crews learned their own version of the same lesson. For most of a battle, their world was steel and periscopes and radio chatter. But when a shell hit just wrong, or a track was blown off in the wrong place, or fire began to pour into the crew compartment, they had seconds. Get out. Grab something. Get away from the burning hull before the ammunition inside cooked off. A full-length rifle is an awkward thing to drag through a narrow turret hatch. A .45 on a tanker's belt, by contrast, came out with him automatically. Veterans' accounts from armored divisions do not read like advertisements. They talk about scrambling into ditches, smoke and confusion, shapes in the hedgerows that might be enemy infantry or panicked friends. The pistol in those stories is a tool for buying time, firing short, desperate strings of shots to keep space around the crew until they could link up with their own riflemen or reach cover. After the Second World War, the same pistol moved on to cold hills and dark nights in Korea. There, in temperatures that froze oil and stiffened steel, men found that a big, all-steel pistol would still cycle, so long as it was kept reasonably clean and lightly lubricated. By the 1960s, the M1911 A1 was already an old design, and yet in Vietnam, there was one group of soldiers for whom it was not just a backup weapon, but the primary tool. The men the press later called tunnel rats. Their job was as simple to describe as it was terrifying to perform. American and South Vietnamese troops kept encountering complex Viet Cong tunnel networks, passages barely wide enough for a man, lined with traps, leading to ammunition caches and hidden fighting positions. Somebody had to go in. Those somebodies were often slight, wiry combat engineers who would strip down to the bare essentials: a flashlight, a knife, sometimes a grenade, and a .45 in their hand. In a tunnel, there is no room to shoulder a rifle. Distances collapse to arm's length. In that black tight space, a heavy, slow .45 bullet fired from a reliable single-action pistol made sense in a way that no paper specification could capture. Tunnel rats later talked about the deafening blast, the flash that stole your night vision, the heat and the smell. But they also talked about trust. Trust that when they pressed that straight little trigger, the hammer would fall, the slide would cycle, and the person at the other end of that narrow tunnel would be stopped. By the end of Vietnam, many of the men who had relied on the old .45 were serving alongside younger troops armed with newer pistols and rifles. Asked afterward what they thought, they often shrugged about ballistics charts and arguments, and simply said things like, "I carried a .45. It worked." Chapter 4. From Standard Issue to Symbol. Officially, the M1911 A1's military career runs from 1911 to 1985. In that year, the United States adopted a new pistol, a high-capacity 9mm more in line with NATO standards and modern doctrine. On paper, the change made sense. 15 rounds in a magazine instead of 7. Standardized ammunition with allies. Easier logistics, new manufacturing. But no symbol leaves quietly. Even as the M1911, A1 left most armories, special operations units quietly held on to it. They valued its trigger. They valued the way a big, slow 45 round behaved at close range. And they valued the fact that after 70 years of service, everyone knew exactly what it would and would not do. Outside the military, the pistol's life was just getting started. Surplus guns, some carried in Europe or the Pacific, some that never left stateside depots, found their way into police holsters, gun shops, and private collections. Gunsmiths discovered that this simple old design was a remarkably flexible canvas. Sights were improved. Triggers were tuned. Frames were reshaped. Magazines extended. Finishes changed. By the late 20th century, there was an entire 1911 world. Competition pistols that barely resembled their wartime ancestors. Compact carry versions, 9mm variants, high-end custom guns that cost more than a whole crate of wartime surplus once had. And yet, under all that customization, the basic geometry and mechanism were still Browning's work. In museums, the story took a quieter form. Behind glass at places like Springfield Armory or the National WW2 Museum, you can see early blued M1911s with their long triggers and flat mainspring housings, alongside Parkerized M1911. A1s from wartime production lines, some built by Colt, some by Remington Rand, some by companies that had never made pistols before the war and never would again. Collectors hunt for rare markings and small variations. A Singer roll mark here, an unusual serial number range there. Proof that even in a mass war, individual details still matter. On screens, the pistol took on another life. In war films, a .45 on an officer's hip became visual shorthand for American. In crime dramas and noir stories, it became the sidearm of detectives and hard-boiled heroes. In video games, the M1911 is almost always there somewhere, a sidearm with heavy damage and a small magazine, reflecting and amplifying the pistol's old reputation for hitting hard with every shot. For people who served with it, the cultural noise sits on top of something quieter. Ask a veteran who carried an M1911 A1 what they think of it today, and you may hear talk of weight and capacity, of how modern pistols are easier to live with day to day. But very often, you will also hear a pause. And then a simpler sentence, something like, "It was heavy, but when I needed it, it was there." And that is the thread that runs from the Philippines through the trenches of France, the islands of the Pacific, the hedgerows of Europe, the hills of Korea, and the tunnels of Vietnam, into museums, collections, and shooting ranges today. The M1911, A1, was never the main weapon of American wars. It was the thing you reached for when everything else had failed, or when there was no time for anything larger. For some men it was too heavy. For others it kicked too hard. But when you ask those who carried it which sidearm they trusted most, the answer often comes without drama. The .45, not whispered, not staged, just a simple verdict on a piece of steel that did its job. To us today, it has a longer name, a museum tag, a place in books and on screens. To them, it was the pistol that was there in the worst half minute of a long war. Thank you for listening.